Hello and welcome to IABSE in Conversation, where I, David Knight, talk to eminent and interesting people in the design and structural engineering community about what inspires them and their life and career. Today I'm delighted to welcome the architect and bridge designer Laura Langridge as my guest. Laura is an architect at Knight Architects and was the 2019 winner of the IABSE Nethercot Prize, an award for early career professionals for a paper that tells a story about their project. Laura, you were brought up in Canada. Was there something in your childhood that sparked your interest in architecture and design?
Thanks, David, for having me. Yeah, I guess growing up, I grew up in a very small rural town. So thinking about architecture, there wasn't really anything exciting in terms of buildings near where I grew up. But I was always interested in making and designing, and that kind of thing has been something that I've been interested since I was very young and grown up with that around me.
What kind of making? What, were you out there with a saw and a hammer, or were you, making things out of cardboard? How did that manifest itself?
I think it was just anything and everything I could get my hands on, making from Lego bricks to learning how to sew to learning how to work with clay, just a variety of different things that I loved doing. And so that really, I think, started to spark in me an interest in design and how that can be then manifest in the world around you.
And did that sort of then morph into an interest in buildings and architecture, or what made you choose architecture as a university degree?
It's one of these things that you kind of get to your later years in school, elementary school, and start to think, okay, I love art, I love making. I also loved maths and physics and those kinds of things. So it was a bit of a natural progression. But I think I've also always had an interest in space and kind of emotional connection to it, the way that being in buildings or around structures makes me feel. And so that kind of drew me into that profession.
So you then moved on to study architecture at the University of Waterloo in Ontario, and I read in your CV that you exhibited some of your work in Toronto. Were you looking at airports as part of your studies? Is that where that came from?
So that project was an interesting project that we did in our third year of studies, and it was a kind of landscape design project. So there's an airport in Toronto on an island just across from the city, and the project was imagining that if the airport had been removed, how that could be reclaimed for the city and used as a public park. So I did that project and really started to research into the natural forces and the landscape that shaped that place. So I did quite a bit of research into erosion patterns and how the water has shaped that land and how it's now kind of slipping away back into the lake there. So I looked at how to design a place that really worked with the landscape, worked with nature, and also was inspired by it.
It's quite interesting because I had read it as more on that infrastructure end, and I was going to say because it's somewhat unusual really for an architect to concentrate on infrastructure design and working for Knights. You're at that infrastructure end of architecture, and it's much more common really to start in commercial work or small residential buildings. So what drew you into infrastructure? Why are you in this sector? Why bridges in particular?
I think it's something that I fell into a little bit. Was definitely always interested in looking at bridges and in looking at how they were made and how they overcame these really interesting technical constraints. So throughout my education and studies, it was something that piqued my interest, but there wasn't really an opportunity for architects to get involved in it. So when I went to Delft, they offered a bridge design course there, and it was the first time I'd ever seen it anywhere, and I jumped on it. And that was my introduction to bridge design and infrastructure design, and it was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. And so when I finished up at Delft, I'd done a bit of work in traditional building architecture and thought, let's give something else a try. And then I've kind of fallen in love with it. It's a really interesting field, very multidisciplinary, and what I didn't expect was the kind of effect that bridges have on the public and people's everyday life, and how it's such a collective thing in our imaginations. Yeah, not in a way that goes beyond just a kind of building or residence that might be one or two people live there, or a smaller group of people that enjoy that space. A bridge is really something that everybody can point to and say, yes, I know where that is. That's something that I use every day.
It's something often forgotten, isn't it, in the way that we design structures, is that emotional response. We are so wedded to either an aesthetic vision or a functional ideal. It needs to do this, needs to do this, needs to do this. But that emotional response, or that spatial understanding of where you are once you see that object, we forget that sometimes in how we design.
Yeah, and I think it's so key to what makes a successful place or a successful project. It's when people say, yes, I love that, or this is a place I want to be and I want to enjoy.
So you said you were at Technical University of Delft. I know Delft mainly for some wonderfully bleak Vermeer landscapes, and this idea of an incredibly flat land. So what took you to Holland? Why were you there?
It's a good question. I finished my degree in Canada, and I loved my degree there, but I've always been interested in learning from new people, new places. The multidisciplinary part of that school also really drew me there, as well as their kind of the studies about flooding and landscape and architecture really interested me as well. So that drew me there, and yeah, it was a really good time.
Yeah, well, it's a great, fantastic experience, isn't it, to leave your home country at that point and to experience a different world, a different culture. The Dutch are very good at English, but there must have been language difficulties in going to the shops. But
a little bit. There's always challenges when traveling, but I think I've worked in a few different countries and traveled through my studies as well, and I think it opens your minds to different ways of thinking, and also I'd like to think that it makes me more of an empathetic designer, that you're able to see different viewpoints and different ways of doing things. So I think that's something that's been very valuable from those experiences.
So you joined Knight Architects in 2016, and Knight Architects is one of the few specialist infrastructure and bridge architects in the UK, because for some reason infrastructure is often built in the UK without any architectural input. What do you think architects bring to the design of bridges and infrastructure?
Yeah, I think generally in our office we like to say that engineers are concerned with the what and the how, and that we bring a different perspective and start to look at who is this for and why is it important. And that's something that I've definitely seen in the work that I'm doing. It's about questioning the brief, looking at it, and looking for opportunities for added value through what we're doing.
And that's a really nice way of thinking about it, isn't it? Rather than, I suppose, an engineer typically will look at an architect involved in a bridge scheme and say, well, it's the pretty pictures, it's the colouring in. Whereas really, you're dealing with the human side of the process.
Definitely with the human side, yes.
That's fine. Yeah. Okay. And your work on the Tide Mills projects, in particular, earned you the Nethercot Prize in 2019. Tell us about the project.
Yes, I can. So the Tide Mills project was something that came to us because Network Rail was looking to replace a level crossing on their network, and it had a few near misses and lots of safety concerns at this site. But the site was also in the middle of the South Downs National Park, a very, very sensitive piece of landscape right next to the ruins of an old settlement. So there were these kind of conflicting constraints that one was we wanted to get a bridge up as quickly as possible, close this level crossing, make it safe, and the other side being that we want something that's fitting of this landscape, that's really deserving to be in that area and doesn't detract from the beauty of that place. So we were brought in to start to look at how we could bring those requirements together in a way that benefited the landscape and the people who used it. So we started that project, we started that project with a really robust research of the landscape, and we did a landscape and visual impact appraisal, which was looking at how the structure would impact views, how it would sit in the landscape. And we used that to build trust with the planners, to speak with the people in the area, to get an understanding of what would really work. And through that piece of research, we developed a project that was really about a journey through the landscape, a journey that enables you to stop and enjoy specific views as you go, and then also how you look at the bridge in the landscape, something that's light, that's transparent, that's not big and imposing and affecting the character in a negative way.
And that process led to a collaborative approach to design, or did you go to talk to the local residents and stakeholders with an idea of where your design was heading?
So in that project itself, we talked with the Built Environment Accessibility panel at Network Rail. We talked about what kind of things that they were looking for. As it was a little bridge over rail line, we had quite a length of approach ramps, so we needed to find a way to make that comfortable and enjoyable for all users. And we spoke with the planners and the various other interested parties there. Friends of Tide Mills.
And is it now under construction? Have you built it already? What stage is the project at?
It's pre-construction, so we're hoping to begin next year on that. It's been a complex it's a little project, but often the little ones have the most kind of complex constraints. Lots of landscape and ecological work that needs to be done before we get on site.
It's a truism about bridge design that the actual size of the span or the bridge doesn't really affect how much design you have to do, because it doesn't scale by the length of the bridge. There's always the same elements to design. So in some cases you repeat them more, but really the design is that a whole object, and that's the same regardless of the size.
Yes.
So you won the Nethercot Prize for your ability to tell a story. Does written work form a key part of how you practice, and how do you think that feeds into the process of design, I suppose?
That's a really good question. I myself don't think I'm the best at writing, but I find that it really helps clarify my thinking in terms of process. So, I mean, you can do all this research, get all this stuff kind of floating around in your head, spinning around, but when you actually sit down to write it, it draws out a story, I believe, so that you can kind of pick these threads in what you're saying and then build on them. So for Tide Mills, the writing, the landscape and visual impact appraisal, the writing of that helped to pick out various themes that then we brought forward into the design of the bridge itself.
It's a very powerful tool that we often forget as part of our armoury as designers, is to look at a scheme or a concept and we forget about telling the story. And as you say, it can help really crystallise something else that's going on in the design process by saying, well, I need to write this down in a particular way or a particular framing. Maybe that will feed back in elsewhere.
Yes, definitely.
And do you have any particular designers that inspire your work? What's your precedent list look like at the minute? Are you feeding on anyone in particular?
I always find this a really difficult question to answer. I'm not sure why. I've always been interested in designers that are very kind of hand process, and really about making. So when you see a piece of architecture that you can see the process of what's been going on in it, I find that extremely fascinating. Off the top of my head, I don't know if I'd come up with any names, but
okay.
it's that kind of, yeah.
There's a sort of sculptural quality then, that process of engagement with the material,
Yes.
and an understanding of how it goes together. And yes, maybe in bridges often it's not by hand, but it's but there's craft, isn't there, involved in that process?
Yes, definitely.
And so, well, you're busy working on other projects at the minute after Tide Mills, but what's next for you? Do you imagine being a bridge designer for the rest of your career, or is this a stepping stone into different channels and parallels, or is the plan just to see what happens?
I think right now I'm just seeing what happens. I'm really enjoying this field, and I'm finding it very interesting. So hopefully get to continue this for a while. I'd like to.
And is there, do you have goals that you want to tick off? Are you keen to do the next longest span in the world, or do you really love being involved in these small community projects, smaller footbridges?
I think for me, it's the small community work, the kind of stuff that's really about engagement with people. We've been working on Pulley Bridge, which is another project at the moment, and that one was quite an extensive period of stakeholder engagement, which was the first time that I'd really been involved in such a personal level in that way, and that's something that I found really enjoyable and really rewarding, to see how that can play out, and then have
tell us about the story of Pulley Bridge. Some of our listeners may not have come across it yet.
Okay, so Pulley Bridge was it is a little community up in the Lake District, teeny tiny, and they had an old stone arch bridge about 200 years old, which they lost tragically in a flood in 2015, completely gone. So we were brought in by the council to lead a stakeholder engagement process to develop a new design for a bridge there. And Pulley Bridge is the name of the village. So this is their identity. This is the name of their town. It's in the Lake District National Park, UNESCO World Heritage Site. So again, same themes of Tide Mills, very sensitive landscape and a very interested population. So we hosted a series of meetings. We had drawings that we pinned up on the wall. People came in, asked questions. So it was a very interactive process, and also a challenging one because we didn't want to come in there and present a design that would polarize the people. And so it was something that we had to build very carefully to bring a consensus within the community. So we started with a series of feedback forms, questions that we would ask them, and instead of saying, what do you want your bridge to look like? Because that's a very, very difficult thing for someone to answer if they're not a bridge designer. It's questions like, what did you like about your old bridge? What didn't you like? What kind of character do you want the new bridge to have? And so I think I read 250 feedback forms that we pulled from Facebook, we pulled from mail that was sent to us, and it was eye-opening to see how passionate people were about design, even if they didn't have the formal education or the weren't bridge designers, but they were passionate about what their community looked like. And So from that, we were able to pull out some very key aspirations. So things like lightness and transparency, respecting the landscape that it was in, and then build a design out of that. So rather than proposing a design and having people vote this one, right? It was building out of a consensus. So that was a really rewarding project.
And so that's been built or installed relatively recently. Have you had any feedback yet on whether the design itself matches what their aspirations were, or is that the next stage? Are you going to go back and ask those questions, or are you hoping that it's fine and leaving it be?
So we lifted it in May, the main span, and lots of the community was out to see it as much as they could be. They were told to stay away as much as possible, but they had a live stream, and it looked like there was quite a bit of excitement. But something that we think has been really special is that a local brewery has made a new bridge beer that they've put the image of the new bridge on. So it's these small kinds of things that you can see people getting excited about it and really wanting to be involved.
That's a fantastic testament to a design, isn't it? To have a beer named after it. I hope it tasted good when you got a chance to taste it.
It's definitely good.
It feels like a great place to leave it. Thank you, Laura, so much for being our guest and for a really interesting conversation and a bit of understanding about where your career is and how it's got there.
Thanks, David.
If you'd like to learn more about Laura's work at Knight Architects, please head to their website www.knightarchitects.co.uk. This is a podcast from the British group of the International Association of Bridge and Structural Engineers. IABSE is a group of designers and engineers that are passionate and inspired by the world around us. To find out more, head to our website www.iabse.org.uk. Thank you very much for listening.